In this video in the STOic TTX Facilitator training, we'll go over note-taking and the final report. This is not going to be a really heavy video, and you might not need this, but we want to be able to provide some tips to make sure, especially that the output that you provide is high quality and consistent, and the participants get from you and from this report that final bit of value from the exercise itself. First, note-taking. We provide a template for note-taking, but it's not meant to force you into one style of note-taking or one way of doing things. Instead, it's there to help remind you of what you need to capture during an exercise. The exercise itself is fairly chaotic and free-form, and lots of tangents and lots of things can happen. And keeping yourself on track and keeping abreast of what you need to capture can be important, because you yourself might get a little lost. So the note-taking template is there to help you. Use it or not. If it works for you, that's great. There are three things you need to be able to capture in the middle of an exercise. You want to capture the key controls, the key resources that the participants reach for and rely on in order to respond to the incident that you've presented. You also want to capture any open questions, and you want to capture the action items that have come up from the participants themselves in the middle of an exercise. So let's take a look at a ransomware type of scenario. During ransomware, there might be antivirus that the participants are looking at. They're looking at reports from the antivirus server. You're looking at the SIEM. You're looking at the help desk tickets, the phone systems, the email systems, all these communication things. Every technology that is mentioned tends to be something that you want to capture and you want to write down. The reason why you want to write this down is because when you list all these things in the report at the end, participants might get surprised. They might get surprised that they rely on certain things, or that they rely on so many things all at once. This is particularly important if the organization is planning to make a change to one of those things, and knowing that actually the incident response team needs those things, or the management people need these things in order to respond. That needs to be known so that there's no surprises. Sometimes that might mean the changes get postponed, or alternates need to be provided. The other thing that you can capture in this, and might become obvious in this process, is where you've got single points of failure. And if you've got resources which, if they're unavailable, mean that the organization can't respond to this event, then that needs to be known too. So capturing those key things can be subtly important, and they tend to be the easiest thing to capture in the middle of an exercise. Concerns and open questions are often easy to identify in an exercise as well. These are the things where people are asking, but what about, hey, do we get a report from the antivirus solution on ransomware? Or, hey, is antivirus installed on that server or these endpoints? Have we updated them? You get these open questions from the participants all the time in the middle of an exercise, and you want to write down every single one of them, especially if they're not answered. If they're already answered, if a participant can answer it, then you probably don't need to write that down. But if there is no answer from the participants, you absolutely need to write those down, because they are really, really important to follow up on, and you include those in the end report. Now, I find that those questions are concerns or they're curiosities that need to be followed up on, and most of them aren't a problem. They aren't an issue. They're not representing a huge gap that needs to be addressed right away. Sometimes just finding the answer is enough, but knowing the answer is what's important. So this isn't a list of things to be really alarmed about. They're just questions to follow up on and make sure that everyone knows the answers to. The last thing you want to be able to capture are the action items. These are the specific things where the participants mention, oh yeah, we should do that. oh yeah, we should update those antivirus clients on those machines, or we should install antivirus on those machines, or we need to update that report, or we need to put in an alternate communication method besides email and phone. These are action items. These are things that they're declaring they ought to do, and you want to capture all of those things down and put them down in your notes. And we want to include them in the report at the end. This next tip is a little advanced, I have found, for some new facilitators, especially for people who are not experienced in cybersecurity or incident response. And that is the capturing of the sequence of the items in the participant's response. What did they do and in what order? And when you've got parallel actions happening, this team is doing this other team is doing that, keeping track of those sequences. For those facilitators that are experienced in cybersecurity and incident response, it's a little easier to capture those things. So if you cannot, if it's just too much load for you as a facilitator, don't worry about it. This is an advanced step. But if you can capture those, and it might be worthwhile to bring in a scribe whose sole job is to listen for the sequence, and then we do, and then we do, and then we do, and write those down. Because what you end up with at the end is what I call a proto-playbook. A playbook is a series of established and approved steps in order to respond to an incident. A proto-playbook is the start of a playbook. It might not be complete, it's certainly not approved, but it's what the participants did or mentioned in the exercise. And a proto-playbook can be really useful for a couple things. One, if the organization doesn't have a playbook for that particular threat, or any playbooks for that matter, then the proto-playbook, the playbook that they invent on the fly during the exercise, can be a great start to one. And recording those steps and what the dependencies are and what's needed throughout all that can be really useful. The other thing you can do with a proto-playbook is compare the steps that they mentioned to the established playbooks that they have. Again, this is not to be an audit or a test to see whether or not they understand their playbooks well enough, but just a comparison. And the gap between the proto-playbook and the established playbook can be very, very interesting and informative. Sometimes the steps that are mentioned in the exercise aren't in the playbook, the established playbook, and the organization or the participants can then consider adding them. Ooh, that's a gap. We should do that. That's a good idea. We should add that to the playbook. Or if they're finding that the steps in the proto-playbook, what they mentioned during the exercise, don't include really important or necessary steps in the playbook, then that needs to be known too. Either the playbook needs to be updated to remove those steps because they're no longer relevant or useful, or you might need to increase training or awareness or availability of the playbooks to make sure that those valid and legitimate steps and important steps are included and people remember to think about in the middle of an incident. So coming up with this proto-playbook, this sequence of steps that the participants go through, can be a real hidden gem and really, really useful. But as I said, we found that some facilitators are a little overwhelmed in the note-taking process, and this is too much. That's perfectly fine. If you can, I certainly recommend capturing that data. Secondly, the report. After you've captured all this information, you want to be able to format it in a way that's going to be the most useful for the participants to follow up on. The STOic TTX framework includes a template for the report and includes those areas that you need to fill in. The report template is designed to be as quick to fill out as possible without too much load, and we found that after even a complex exercise that report can be filled out in between 30 to 45 minutes. It's not that bad. There's not a lot of words, there's not an introduction, there isn't a summary and a conclusion, it's just the facts, and it can be really, really useful. If your organization requires a more formal report, you're certainly welcome to create that. The framework has just a very, very condensed, streamlined type of report. The report includes a description of the scenario and the injects that were used, not the injects that were prepared by the facilitator, but the injects that were actually used. It's really important to include those, what the participants actually responded to, because upon review, and especially if there are a lot of these exercises being done, Knowing what the participants have responded to in the past can be important. You can then use that, or you or they can then use that information to look for certain details or certain injects that they haven't experienced and maybe they should. So keeping a record of that can be useful. The next is the key controls that you've written down in your notes. These are the things that the participants are relying on in order to respond effectively and appropriately to the incident. Then there are the key findings section. The key findings are the open questions and the concerns that were raised, and in the report, these are categorized and numbered. They're categorized as to whether or not it represents a gap or not. Sometimes they're just open questions that aren't a gap or not an issue. They're not a deficiency or an inefficiency. It's just an open question. And they're categorized in terms whether or not the concern or the question is skill-based, knowledge-based, technology-based, or process-based. This can be really helpful to quantify the effort that's going to be required, or whether or not the gap, if it's a gap, is a concern that might be technology-based and therefore might require an expenditure of funds. Most often in an exercise, though, and we only know this because we categorized the key findings in these reports, most often the concerns and the open questions are not technology-based, they're more process-based or skill or knowledge-based. And that can be really reassuring for a participant group. Then there are the recommendations and the action items. The action items are what were mentioned in the exercise by the participants themselves. The recommendations can be born from the concerns or the open questions. And those concerns and open questions then result in action items and things to follow. You can map those action items or those recommendations to the concerns or the open questions, the key findings up above, and there's a space for that. And again, those action items are categorized in terms of skill, knowledge, technology, or process gap. Then there is the proposed future scenario section. This is subtly important and often eye-opening as well. It also helps the facilitator for the next scenarios. Oftentimes, during an exercise, the participants themselves will propose certain scenarios inspired by the scenario that they're working at the moment. They might say, oh yeah, we should absolutely run a scenario where this happens or where that happens, or we're doing a ransomware scenario, but we really ought to be doing a denial of service because if that server went down, that has a lot of dependencies, we need to deal with that. We should exercise what would happen if that server went down. So these types of scenarios get proposed. One of the other things that I like to do is to ask participants themselves during the exercise, hey, what scenarios would you like to run? And we'll get into what that question means and how I use that question in the delivering a scenario video. But you want to capture those as well. This inspires the next scenarios to do and encourages a constant participation and a constant cycle of exercising in the organization. The last thing that we've included in the report template is an action item tracker. This is not for the facilitator. This is for the lead person on the team or the participant group in order to keep track of the action items. And it's basically a project management little template to add. And this is a value add that we have from the framework. It's not meant for the facilitator to fill out at all. This is truly a tool for the participant group themselves. So this has been the explanation of the note-taking template and the report template. And the whole purpose here is to be able to capture those key controls that the participants rely upon, the open questions that are raised during the exercise, and the action items that are raised in the exercise, so that the participants have something concrete and something structured that they can then deal with moving forward and improve their incident response abilities.